Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today we're doing part 75 of our Jurassic World Evolution 2 mod spotlights, where we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and use them to talk and compare them to their real life fossil counterparts. So today we've got quite an interesting assortment of animals we've got happy to get stuck into. We've also got another little pack that we've got going, the Seas and Skies pack. So we've got a couple flying animals and a few marine animals, which is quite awesome. We don't often get flying animals anymore. It's mostly just dinosaurs, but now we're getting a bit of an assortment, which I'm quite happy to get stuck into. So we're going to be starting off with the land animals today. So we've got another mod by Chocolate. This is a remake of his old Rapetosaurus, so we're going to have a look at the new one. New updated, and it looks really, really nice. So look at these wonderful guys. Let's have a look at this one. Oh, I love this one here. He's the one's a nice color. Well, they're all kind of the same. I think I forgot to put switch skins on, but we'll have a look at this guy anyway. So this is Rapetosaurus. So these guys are Titanosaurian sauropod that lived in Madagascar from about 70 to 66 million years ago, right up to the end of the Cretaceous period. It is known from one species, Rapetosaurus karunski. So these guys were fairly typical for sauropods, having long slender tails, long necks, and huge elephant-like bodies. Also had their head very similar to a diplodocid, even though they're closely related, so they had a similar niche, pencil-like teeth for grabbing on plants, not too different. But one of the things is that was interesting as well is it was quite modest. It wasn't a very big animal. The juvenile specimen that is found is probably about 8 meters or 26 feet long from head to tail, and the adult was about twice as long, about 15 meters, so about 49 feet long, which is still less than half the size of its giant relatives, animals such as Argentinosaurus and Thalassotitan. Though in 2020, the estimated size for adult specimens, which is known from a femur, was about 16 meters and about 10 tons, so about the same size as a really large African elephant. So this guy is known, as I mentioned, from the single species Rapetosaurus karunski. It was marked the first titanosaur to be found with an almost completely intact skeleton and complete with a skull. And it helped actually clarify some older taxonomy, century-old taxonomy within the groups of dinosaurs, and creates a good baseline for reconstruction of other titanosaurs which are known from more partial fossils. So this guy was first discovered in 2001 by Christina Curry Rogers and Catherine A. Foster, which was published in Nature, and the nearly complete specimen is that of a juvenile, but there have been remains of other adult individuals, as I mentioned, found. So the dig uncovered a partial skull of the holotype specimen, another partial skull, a juvenile skeleton missing only a few tail vertebrae, and an unrelated vertebra. And the juvenile specimen, or the skeleton, is the most complete titanosaur ever recovered, and the only one with its head still attached to its body. So very, very lucky to have that. So in terms of where it was found in the Mahajanga Basin in northwest Madagascar, and not far from the port city of Mahajanga, and part of the Merino Formation, which dates back between about 70 million years ago. So it would have lived with some really cool animals like Majangosaurus and Smilosukis and Beelzebufo, things like that. The name Rapetosaurus, though, is derived from Rapeto, which is a giant deity in Malagasy folklore, and Sauros, which means lizard. And the epithet Crassis comes from the leader of the expedition, David W. Krause. You say that? So the rare specimen that was actually found, the specimen was actually, the juvenile was believed to be about 40 kilograms and only between 39 and 77 days old at the time of death. So, and at the time of hatching, the juvenile was estimated to be about 3 kilograms. So they grow really, really fast. Sauropods are known for growing really, really fast because that was basically their only defense, to get as big as fast as possible. So these little ones had to get big quite fast. 40 kilograms in 70 days. It's like 3 months. That's incredible. And based on bone remodeling, they're also believed to be able to survive with little to no parental care. So very much like sea turtles, they laid their eggs and went off and did their thing, and then the babies had to come out and, fend for themselves. But sadly, the analysis of the bones revealed that young Rapetosaurus likely starved to death during one of the harsh droughts in the Cretaceous Madagascar, which is quite sad. As I mentioned, Madagascar was an island in the even back in the Maastrichtian. So it had split off from India about 20 million years beforehand, and it was a seasonal climate with floodplains and sandy rivers and wet and dry season, things like that. And the animals, as I mentioned, we know with lots of crocodilomorphs, Mesocosaurus, Majungasaurus, a wide variety of cool mammals like Gondwanatheres, a Dilithium, and animals like that. And animals like Majungasaurus would have probably been prey on these guys, so preyed on younger and potentially even sick and older individuals. And typically, titanosaurs are actually unusual among sauropods as these guys would have coexisted with animals such as ceratopsians, hadrosaurs, and ankylosaurs. Though the Majunga Basin, they would have basically been the only big herbivore in the habitat. Other animals that were herbivores, though, like Smilodocus and things like that, but they were generally absent of ornithischian dinosaurs like hadrosaurs, sauropsids, and ankylosaurs. So these guys kind of had a different niche, and that shows how like islands have always been a bit weird. But yeah, really, really cool. I love to see the new osteoderms. I love the new patterns and everything. I think I forgot to put the random patterns on, but still really, really cool and nice Rapetosaurus. Nice little upgrade. So I'm gonna let you run off and do your thing, of course. Next up, we've got Master mod. This is Rubidgea. Or did we say that? This one's quite cool. You look at him standing there having a good time. Let's pick this one. I like this one. He's got a nice posture on him. This is Rubidgea. I'll just go with that. Rubidgea was a genus of Gorgonopsid. I know we all love the Gorgonopsids. From the Upper Permian of South Africa and Tanzania, containing the species Rubidgea atrox. And the generic name Rubidgea is believed to be the surname of a renowned Karoo paleontologist, Professor Rubidgea, who had contributed a lot to the research of cerapsids of the Karoo Basin. However, the generic name was actually erected on of his grandfather, Sidney Rubidgea, who was a renowned fossil hunter, and atrox just means savage, things like that. And they were part of the Gorgonopsian subfamily Rubidgenidae, which was a derived group of large-bodied Gorgonopsians that lived in the late Permian. And they reached the highest diversity in the assemblage zones, the Subrophalus and Daptocephalus, in the Beaufort Group in South Africa. So the Karoo Basin is a very, very rich place in South Africa that shows fossils pretty much from like the Permian all the way up to the early Jurassic. So we have a great history of that time. So the first fossils were discovered by C.J.M. Crony Kitchling, who was the father of the renowned paleontologist James Kitching, on the farm Donnerberg outside the small town New Bethesda in the 1930s, and was first named a fossil Rubidgea kitcheni, and then it was noted to be quite large for a Gorgonopsid, so it seems to be a new species. And subsequent discoveries show that these guys were a new family, a subfamily of Gorgonopsids, and then Rubidgea was as described or was erected. So these guys are known as the largest African Gorgonopsids, and one of the largest Gorgonopsids to have lived. So these guys were up there with Innistransevia, things like that. Their largest specimens had skulls measuring up to 46 centimeters, or about 1.5 feet long, so quite big. And it's quite a heavily built, large-bodied apex predator, where you see these large canines. So, like other Gorgonopsids, these guys would have been like the first saber-tooths, probably using them to hunt prey. And these guys as a whole were actually some of the largest Gorgonopsids to live only outside of Innistransevia. And they're characterized by their particularly robust skulls, which is happy Pakistani, so very bony and really robust skeletons. And there are 3 species known in this genus, so Atrox, Platyrrhina, and Majora. So as I mentioned, these guys are a subfamily of Gorgonopsids that have only been found in Africa, and this group consists of about 6 different genera and 17 different species. And these guys are closely related to the Innistransevia, which is only found in Russia, and there was a couple African species found recently. And out of the Gorgonopsian clade, the systematics have been best resolved due to diagnostic traits. So they seem to be a lot of cranial homomorphism, which means kind of similar skulls to these guys. That's how they're typically identified. So there's kind of the Russian clade and the African clade and the Rubidgea, this really interesting group of African Gorgonopsids, which is quite cool. And yeah, really, really awesome. Love to see these guys in the game. Love how they've been reconstructed here. Master Dude always does a wonderful job with a monster like this. Really, really cool. Definitely a big fan. So I'm going to let you run off and do your thing. So now we're going to move on to the Sea and Skies pack that was done by Gushigor and a lot of other people. Too many to kind of name in a big list. But yeah, really excited to have a look at this one. So first one, we'll open up Darwinopterus. So here we are, Darwinopterus, which means Darwin's wing. So it's got its name from a very interesting way. So Darwinopterus is a genus of pterosaur discovered in China and named after biologist Charles Darwin, of course. So there's been between 30 to 40 different specimens of this genus identified, all collected from the Tianjin Formation, which dates to the Middle Jurassic period between 160 0.89 to 160.25 million years ago, so between 160, so it's quite a tight range. And the type species is Modularis, which was described in 2010. And actually, Modularis is actually the first known pterosaur to display features of both rhamphorhynchid or long-tailed pterosaurs and later short-tailed pterodactylid pterosaurs. So it's kind of like an in-between. It's described as a transitional fossil, which is quite cool. And then two other species were first described, which is D. linglongensis and robustidens from the same formations in December 2010 and June 2011, respectively. So as I mentioned, these guys, like its closest relatives, have a unique combination of both derived and basal traits, which makes them really interesting. So they have a tail and all of other characteristics that are quite similar to rhamphorhynchids, but they also had a long vertebrae and things like that, which is quite characteristic of later pterodactylids, which is really, really cool. And on their own group subfamily of Wukongderidae, which has all sorts of different, like really interesting, weird pterosaurs. And one way you can tell them apart from those kind of animals, they do have a thin, bony excision in the skull with a serrated edge. You can see kind of going out there. And the serrations probably help anchor like a big structure, so you can see it's got a big crest going on right there, which is quite cool. So as I mentioned, there's been a couple derived into 3 species based on size and the shape of the teeth. So the first one, Modularis, had kind of a especially elongated beak and spike-like teeth. And then the other one had a shorter but taller skull with shorter cone teeth. And then Robustidens from a new specimen has very, very big, robust teeth. And this is believed because they were implying and taking different ecological niches within the ecosystem. So Robustidens was believed to be feeding on hard-shelled beetles or things like that. And other species would likely have been eating different things, so they were all able to specialize and avoid competing with each other, which is quite cool. So because they're so well preserved, we do know a lot about their ecology and patterns of anatomy, things like that. So we have a good example of sexual dimorphism in these guys because they have a large amount of variety. So we do have one that is preserved with an egg between its thighs. So this is likely would have been, before it died, before it laid, which is quite interesting. And the specimen had a broad pelvis and lacked evidence of a crest. So it's very likely the crest was a very sexual thing, like males have bigger crests than the females. So this is believed to support the hypothesis of sexual dimorphism. However, it has been criticized a lot that other animals such as ceratopsians all have crests and still are males and females. So Mrs. T may have just simply been a subadult that didn't grow up enough to have her crest. Because like animals can breed when they're subadults, you might have just had an egg in her. But then the specimen was reassigned to Aegirocassis, which is very interesting. And so it likely may have just been a different species, and it's not consistent. So it's kind of, that was initially proposed, but it's just kind of consistent. But as I mentioned, we did find the specimen with an egg that does show a lot of insight into their reproductive strategies. So these guys would have had soft eggs, like a parchment-like. In modern birds, eggs are quite hard, but soft cell eggs are permeable, that allows water to come in. So the eggs would have been more similar to like things of snakes rather than birds. So these soft shells would have been a little bit more vulnerable to the environments, but they were buried in soil. The eggs of this species would have been about 6 grams when laid, and with moisture intake, they would have been probably double in size. So the eggs were actually quite small compared to their mother. So the Mrs. T specimen weighed about between 110 grams to 220 grams, and more like modern reptile eggs and birds. But the main difference is that these guys were basically born ready to hatch as they go. So a lot of smaller birds today, they have to go through like a fledging period to be able to fly. They sit in the nest for a bit. A lot of them can't fly right out of the egg, but pterosaurs they could. So once they kind of hatched, they didn't need much parental care, and they would have been able to pretty much fly really much right out of the egg. And this would have been very different from birds and a lot of that ecology. And very interesting, the specimen that showed that it had an additional egg, so they very likely had 2 active ovaries, unlike most birds that only have 1 active ovary, which allows them to produce pretty much 2 eggs on the go. And very interesting as well, we do know their diet. So, like most Rubidgeas were terrestrial predators, they didn't have evidence of eating fish, and they would have been originally terrestrial forms. Originally, it was described to being like a hawking carnivore, kind of like a raptor. However, they don't show any evidence of aerial predation. Instead, they've been thought to be an insectivore, hopping along trees, akin to bottom passerines and songbirds, hunting prey like that. And as I mentioned, robust dens may be eating particularly hard-shelled foods, which is quite interesting. And the reason it got the name Darwinopterus, as I mentioned, is the researchers saw that this has like that mix of traits. So it's a transitional fossil, so it's got some traits from the later pterodactylids, that would lead to become the starkids and pteranodon and pterodactylids and things like that, while it still has things like Rhamphorhynchus type animals, like Rhamphorhynchus, sword ends, things like that. And this shows that it wasn't very much, a hard transition. It was a mix. So the mix of these features suggests they were on that line to becoming the newer ones, which is quite cool. But yeah, really, really awesome. So that's Darwinopterus. So I'm going to let them fly off and do their thing. I was going to say run off, but they can't really run, can they? At least not in the game. So now we've got a very interesting one. We've got an Astarchid pterosaur. I'm sure if you guys watch Prehistoric Planet, you'll be familiar with this guy. This is Phosphatodraco. I think we'll let him fly around a bit. There we are. So this is Phosphatodraco. So Phosphatodraco is definitely one of those later pterosaurs as we mentioned. So these guys were an Astarchid that lived during the late Cretaceous of Morocco. And in 2000, it was found in the Osphaladon phosphatic basin. And the species was given the new holotype and genus and species of Phosphatodraco maturinidens in 2003, which means the dragon of the phosphates. And the specific name refers to the region of Mantineria, which is what was found. And actually, this guy was the first late Cretaceous pterosaur known from North Africa, and the second pterosaur genus described from Morocco. And is one of the only Astarchids that preserves a relatively complete neck, and actually was also one of the last known pterosaurs. And since then, it's been found with other species of pterosaurs, like Phosphatodraco, Barbarodactylus, Tethydraco, things like that, which is quite cool. So, in terms of its discovery, I'll talk about a little bit about it. It's quite fragmentary, as I mentioned, it's really only known from neck vertebrae. But it has been interpreted to have a wingspan of about 5 meters, potentially up to 4 meters, so 4 to 5 meters, so a mid-size range of pterosaurs, so definitely not the biggest but not the smallest, based on its kind of sizes. And its closest relatives would have been Astarchodraco and Astarcho, which were originally, considered like skim feeders, but looking at their morphology with their long stick necks, they would have thought to be very more similar to like ground hornbills or storks, hunting that way. And these pterosaurs were thought to have declined in diversity during up to the time of the extinction of the Cretaceous, but that's been proven wrong by this area, because this is right in the Strictrian, happened right before the extinction of the dinosaurs, and they were still alive and kicking and still quite diverse. We had Astarchids, pterodactyls, and everything, so that kind of put a spanner in that. So as I mentioned, it was during the late 1990s there had been remains of pterosaurs found around Morocco, dating to the Cretaceous, and then in 2000 this one was found in the phosphate beds, which is quite interesting. And Phosphatodraco obviously means dragon from the phosphates, as I mentioned, because that's where the kind of rocks it was founded. And then 2018, Nicholas Longrich and other people found within the industry found a lot of other species of pterosaurs, like including another specimen of Phosphatodraco. So this included 2 cervical vertebrae that are very similar to the holotype. And then in 2020, they found some that were assigned to Tetradraco, which was originally considered to be a pterodactyloid, but is sometimes also considered a starkid. So found a little bit more evidence of that. And then it actually found to potentially be more actually bits of Phosphatodraco. So we may have a bit more than we realize, which is quite cool. So in terms of description, as I mentioned, at a wingspan close to 5 meters, would have been a large predator. So it would have been a mid-size, kind of like comparable to Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, which is the larger species, smaller species. The larger species would have been Northropy. They got to the big size. These guys would have been in the mid-size range for pterosaurs, starkids, I mean. And these guys, there's kind of 2 main types of starkid skulls, which are very long, low skulls, and then there were some that were much shorter, that were closer to other pterosaurs. And Phosphatodraco likely had the former, though we don't really know. And like other pterosaurs, they would have had their wings based on their pinky, and they had the 3 fingers there. Very interesting wing shapes as well. And they would have been covered in pycnofibers, which could be feathers, or something analogous to feathers. And as I mentioned, we have good cervical vertebrae from Phosphatodraco, and they seem to be quite long and quite pneumatized, so they would have been light to allow them to fly, which is quite cool. And in terms of classification, I measured they are in the stark. They seem to be a basal member to the group Quetzalcoatlin, which includes, of course, Quetzalcoatlus, but it includes Hexagopteryx, Acryodracon, and Elzadraco. So these guys would have been kind of an early relative to things like Quetzalcoatlus and Hexagopteryx, where they fed out in the family tree of the starkids. But originally they were found to be still quite similar, and it's to be sister taxon to Elzadraco. So they seem to be not changed much in the dinosaur family tree. But yeah, look really, really cool. We do love our starkids. Very, very awesome animals. So let's see if we can. I find it funny how he's lonely, but we can only have one at a time because it's based on the quets. But yeah, really, really awesome. Definitely a big fan of how this guy's come out. Really, really cool. So, next up, we're going to our really awesome... So now we're going to have a look at a really awesome member of this, season Skies Back. We're going to the seas now. We're having go all the way back to the Ordovician. We have Aegirocassis. So this wonderful guy, Aegirocassis, really, really awesome. So these guys are an extinct genus of giant raphodont arthropod, or radiodont, from the family Hunoridae in the early Ordovician from Morocco, and is known from a single species, Aegirocassis balomni. And they initially, when they first look at the fossils, they actually they were the earliest known example of a giant filter feeder. So these guys would have been considered to evolve from early predatory raphodonts, similar things to kind of like Anomalocaris, things like that. And as characterized, as you can see, got the very large forward-facing head and the endiles at the front appendage that are very much like baleen that allow them to filter out of the water, which is quite interesting. And is analogous, as I mentioned, to baleen. So this animal evolved filter feeding, which was most likely the result of the big event, the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, where the environmental changes actually caused a really huge biodiversity or explosion in diversity in plankton, which turns allowed the evolution of new suspension feeding life forms like this guy, along with its closer relatives Pseudo-Augustinus and in other undescribed Hurridids and other species. These guys were one of the few dinocaridids actually survived from the post-Cambrian, so they actually survived the post-Cambrian and became, these big filter feeders, and they made it have that niche, which is quite interesting. And their closest relatives are things like Opabinia, Pyridinus, things like that. So very interesting. And Homolocaris is a little bit later on the tree, but these guys would have lived later, as I mentioned. They are from the Ordovician. So Cambrian Ordovician is the next period. So these guys would have been the largest known radiodont and the largest known animal to exist in this period. So right from the early Ordovician, they got to a length potentially over 2 meters, or about over 6 feet 6. So they were preserved in quite well detail, three-dimensional detail, unlike a lot of other radiodont fossils which are flattened. So each of these guys have both a ventral and dorsal pair of flaps, and these guys have a ventral pair that are quite homologous to arthropods and lophopone limbs as well, which is quite cool. And a lot of them have these flaps, which obviously would have helped them with swimming and things like that. And you can see that long bit, that's for their filter feeding. And the frontal appendage, you can see, have 5 endiles, as you can see. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there's a little bit extra there, but you can see they've also got these bits. It's almost actually like a mesh to allow them to filter feed all sorts of small zooplankton and things like that. And it was probably able to consume mesozooplankton roughly the same size as species like Tamiocaris and allow them to catch. However, the spines on the frontal appendage of Aegirocassis were inward angled. That allowed them to overlap to a degree. That allowed them to have more degree of control over the mesh. So allowed them to better control what they're actually filtering. And this could lead to them having the larger sizes and reaching on larger sizes than zooplankton that Tasmiocaris did. And this large carapace may have actually helped to guide the feeding currents in the frontal appendages, and the eyes and mouth parts are actually not known, but since it was probably a filter feeder, it would have lacked the hard mouth parts and had a flexible one, which is potentially why these guys don't have the mouth preserved. But in terms of these guys where they're found, the fossil was found in Morocco, was discovered by Mohammed Ben Mola, and the fossil collector who recognized how rare it was and then gave it to the paleontologist Peter van Rooij at the Gerard Museum in Belgium. So yeah, really, really cool. Very, very interesting animal. Huge too, so this would have been quite a big boy, especially for the time, 2 meters long, enormous. And what comes with this guy as well, we've got a krill feeder. So you can see, if you look over here, see if you can actually find some krill in the water. I don't know if we can, but there is krill. So is a krill feeder now. So this comes in the pack. You get to have a look. I don't know if there's any in here. Maybe we could just go quickly disperse one. I don't know what happened there. We'll make sure it disperses one. It's because it's paused. So you can see there's a thing of krill. Where'd it go? Yeah, it has like a little krill, because krill, we all love krill. Let's try that again. So you can see that's the krill going on there. Really, really cool. Love to see some new feeders. I really hope we get a base game krill feeder though. Anyway, still another cool little extra bit of the pack for your Aegirocassis, so they can have something to eat. Next up, we have got another really cool animal. We've got Cretoxyrhina. So here we have Cretoxyrhina. Let me swim out a little bit more. There we are. Look at this guy. How pretty they are. Well, look at you. Oh no, we'll let you swim a bit first. Here we are. So this is Cretoxyrhina. Cretoxyrhina, which means Cretaceous sharp nose. These guys are an extinct genus of large mackerel shark that lived between 107 and 73 million years ago during late Albian to late Campanian of the Cretaceous. So the types, there's a few different species described, but the most common one is C. mantelli, which is most commonly referred to the Ginsu shark because its teeth look like the Ginsu knife. And it's referred to as the Ginsu, in reference to the Ginsu knife, and its theoretical meating mechanism is often compared to slicing and dicing like you would with the type of knife. and they were traditionally classified as likely the sole member of the family Cretoxyrhinidae, but other placements have been placed, such as within Elapidae and Lemuridae. So, as I mentioned, these guys were first described by English paleontologist Gideon Mantell from 8 Mantelli fossils teeth that he found in the Sumholm Grey Pit in East Sussex. And then 1822 he described them, and he looked at them and he thought they were smaller than the common smooth hound, but as large teeth from soft hammerhead, and kind of looked at them and actually described them as their own species. And I believe there's about 8 different species described, 4 different species described. There were more, but now we've got about 4 at the moment. The most common one being Mantelli. But as I mentioned, other species have been found. They're from the Nabarra Chalk in Kansas, and other species have been found like Mantelli. And we actually do have some pretty good fossils of this guy, which is quite interesting. So some have been found of a really Nabarra formation. There's been a couple really excellently found skeletons, and even preserves the outlines of Cretoxyrhina, so we know it pretty much looked like a Cretaceous version of a great white shark. That's why it didn't have the spike here. I believe this is kind of a speculative thing that Goshi added, but this is something that's really only found in earlier sharks and some different types of sharks, not in the large mackerel sharks that we know this guy belonged to, or those kind of animals. But yeah, there's a few different species described, and some have been known from different looking at the dental details and its phylogeny, and we actually have a pretty good idea what it looks like, and like animals such as Megalodon, which is quite cool. So in terms of its phylogeny evolution, it is thought to resemble the great white shark in a lot of ways because it's in its shape, size, and ecology, though it was a little bit bigger. But they're not that closely related. They are both lamniform sharks or mackerel sharks, but they weren't that closely related. And it's believed to be this is because of convergent evolution, since they were both large predators in the oceans. They evolved to be similar because they are doing similar things in the environment. And there's 4 valid species at the moment. There's Verruconensis, Jejukala, Aegirocassis, and Mantelli, and thought to resemble chronospecies. So the earliest species is Verruconensis, that is 107 million years old, then evolved into Jejukala from the early Cenomanian, Argenensis from the mid-Cenomanian, and then Mantelli would have lived in the late Cenomanian. So it kind of chronospecies, how they evolved over time. So the youngest species, C. Mantelli, I believe, is still the largest, and these are the individuals that would have lived in the Western Terran Seaway. And the youngest specimens of Mantelli have been found in the Bear Paw Formation that lived in Alberta, that lived about 73 million years ago, but some have been identified potentially up to 70 million years ago, so they would have had quite a long range, though it could likely have been reworked from an older layer. So phylogenies looking to these guys actually thought they may have been convergent with the modern thresher sharks, but there's kind of don't know about that. And other people that have been looking, they were thought to be the same of mako sharks, but this seems to be all convergent evolution. They're likely a very different group. So in terms of its morphology, as we mentioned, they have the basic dental characteristics of a mackerel shark, and there are differences between the species, with Dendrocata having some of the largest teeth, and the largest tooth discovered from the species may be up to 8 centimeters long. I believe Mantelli, they're all a little bit different, though Mantelli has the best known of dentition, because it's just such a well-known, it has near completely articulated dentition, and pretty well-known. Mantelli is the best known of all the Cretoxyrhinids because we have pretty good specimens, and these guys they have partial jaws and things as well. And they have very, very round, blunted teeth that almost look like mako sharks. So they seem to be very similar to mako sharks in this regard, like slicing and dicing, which is quite cool. We also have the skull as well. These guys likely had a very conical head with a flat and wide skull, and they would have been very similar to modern crocodile sharks and thresher sharks. They would have had large eyes, which is quite interesting. So they probably would have been able to see quite well. It takes up 1/3 of their skull length, so they had quite big eyes. And these skulls as well would have been quite kinetically powerful, so they seem to have quite robust build like that of a modern mako, but otherwise were similar and gentle. So they were like a really bulky mako shark in terms of anatomy, or kind of like a really lean great white, potentially. That could be a way of saying it. But we Luckily, we do have some near-complete skeletons with vertebral columns as well. Since most species are only known from vertebrae, teeth and vertebrae, however, Metzli has been quite well preserved because that formation has lots of calcium that allows the cartilage of their bones to be better preserved. And numerous skeletons have been preserved, with the largest vertebrae being up to 3 inches in diameter, and they represent the best vertebral columns of the species, which is quite cool. An analysis of the partially completed tail fin suggests that these guys would have had crescent-shaped tails, very similar to modern laminid whale and basking sharks. And the transition would have been between the 140th to 160th vertebrae out of the 230 vertebrae they had. And would have had the highest possible angle, of the vertebral bend, and is found very similar to most fast-swimming sharks in the laminids, like right whites, makos, things like that. So they would have very much had that very similar ecology and would have been quite fast swimmers. Very interesting as well, there is evidence of the earliest forms of endothermy in these guys was known as mesothermy, so they would have been regionally endothermic. So very similar to modern sharks like great whites. They would have been partially warm-blooded, so they would have had blood vessels that would have provided metabolic heat to be conserved and exchanged in vital organs. So they would have been partially warm-blooded, so basically like their brain and some of their other organs would have been a little bit warmer than the water around them, but they weren't like full-blood endothermy like a mammal or a mosasaur would have been. So this is believed to be regional endothermy may have actually developed with the increasing pressure and also the cooling of the Earth, because even back in the Cretaceous there was a lot of glaciers and things like that. It would allow them to take advantage of different environments, very similar to modern great whites. So that's a great example of convergent evolution as well. As well, these guys, as I mentioned, they would have had highly dense overlapping placonoscales that would have reduced drag and allowed them to swim quite fast. They would have been quite fast swimmers, which is quite cool. And these guys, as I mentioned, would have been quite big, about 8 meters long, a little bit bigger than the great whites. So, although there's no fossil evidence of these guys breeding, we think these guys would have been ovoviparous, just like modern mackerel sharks. So, would have bred very similar to, modern great whites and things like that. They would have had the eggs inside their body, and then the mother would lay eggs and kind of they would eat their litter mates, or they would eat eggs, unfertilized eggs that their mother made. And these guys were very likely our selective sharks, so these guys would have had lots of babies, since they would have been living in areas with mosasaurs, things like that. They would have tried to make as many babies as possible, but have high mortality rates. And it seems like sharks, like thresher sharks, great whites, and things like that, would have made 2 to 9 babies per litter. So that would have been kind of the great, the good zone, I would say, the Goldilocks zone. But also, like more mackerel sharks, they do have growth rings in their vertebrae, so we're able to kind of figure out how old some are. But only a few have been described as the ages, looking into them. So using this equation, there's some specimens that have believed to show a length of about 1.28 meters, or about 4 feet long, and weighed about 16 kilograms at birth, and it would have grown quite rapidly for the first 2 years of their life, and doubled in length at about 3.3 years. And some specimens we have are about 15 years old that are about 5 meters long, and the maximum lifespan is believed to be 38.2 years old, which have grown about 7 meters. But we believe that great whites initially could live 70 years old plus. So these guys likely would have probably lived quite old lives, potentially like a great white, which is quite cool. So they could have been up to 70, 80 years old. And reassessments as well, they're saying sexual maturity about 4 to 5 years of age. Things like that, and some fossils would have been about 26 years old. And looking, as I mentioned, great white sharks, they could have potentially got up to even 60, 80 years old. But these guys, such rapid growth rates would have allowed them to get quite big quite fast, so they were out of the range of a lot of predators that lived with them, like Xiphactinus, smaller mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, things that could attack them. Yeah, there are some specimens that are quite small. There's a lot of variation within the species. Some about 4 meters long as an adult, which is Deltricata, and then as I mentioned, Mantelli was kind of the bigger one. They would have got about 744 kilograms. Mantelli would have been the biggest, as I mentioned, probably weighed at least a couple tons, considering it was 8 meters long. But in terms of its paleobiology, as I mentioned, these guys would have been very active predators and would have been one of the big predators in the marine ecosystem in the late Cretaceous. That they would have only shared this role with kind of large mosasaurs. They would have preyed on fish like Siphaectinus, turtles, young mosasaurs, other sharks, with most fossils of Cretoxyrhina feeding upon other animals have bite marks on their bone, with their teeth embedded in them. We've also seen the bones of mosasaurs and other marine reptiles in their coprolites. There's also some specimens that preserve food in their stomach, like a large ichthyodented Siphaectinus and a mosasaur in its belly, so these guys definitely fed on mosasaurs. There also is a really, really well-preserved fossil of a Cretoxyrhina eating a pterosaur, which is quite interesting, and also with cervical vertebrae from a pteranodon in its stomach, which is quite cool. And in terms of hunting strategies, these guys would have... we can't really tell if they were scavenging or hunting, but most likely they would have fed very similar to like modern lamnids and requiem sharks, similar to great white. These guys had a cosmopolitan distribution. They've been found all over the world, though there's notable notifications they've been found as North America, Europe, Israel, and Kazakhstan, living in pretty much very similar to great whites, to at least temperatures with an average sea temperature between 5 to 10 degrees or 41 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and are quite well known, as I mentioned, from the Western Interior Seaway, which has got the best fossils in them. But also they would have liked these kind of more open water habitats and may have occasionally swum into fresh water, but it's kind of hard to tell. But these guys would have been found pretty much all over the world and would have lived in open waters all across the world. And in terms of competition, would have lived with a lot of mosasaurs, pliosaurs, other types of sharks would have been competition as well. And it's believed we don't know why they went extinct, but they kind of peaked in their size in the Cretaceous, and then it believed to be potentially the rise of larger predators like Thalassours and things like that would have led to their extinction. So they may have just gone to extinct just because competition of Thalassours and things like that may have contributed to their decline and maybe even their extinction. But yeah, really, really cool. Definitely love Cretoxyrhina. Really, really awesome animal. So we're going to let them swim off and do their thing. So our last Gushy Gore pack animal, we've got Tanystropheus. So let's have a look at these guys. Sorry, I've got a bit stuck in my throat. Anyway, let's have a look at these guys. So this is Tanystropheus. Really, really awesome animal. So Tanystropheus, which is means long-hinged, is a extinct genus of archosauromorphs. So these are early relative, of crocodiles and dinosaurs, things like that. Lived during the Jurassic of Europe, Asia, and North America, and the obvious more way to recognize it, as you can see, it's got that stupidly long neck, and there's about 13 vertebrae, which is also strengthened by extensive cervical ribs. So it's actually one of the most well-described non-archosauriform archosauromorphs, known from quite a few skeletons, and believed to, there's about 3 species known, with, I believe the species Hydrodens actually got to like 20 feet long, or about 6 meters, and the longest non-archosaurium archosauromorph as well, which is quite interesting. So let's carry on, we'll talk about them. So 19th century was kind of first found. It was really interpreted that these guys were long-tailed pterosaurs, but actually because they thought the vertebrae were the finger bones, but these guys were actually which was obviously wrong, so that was being interpreted correctly as their neck. And the first species, Longibranchus, was renamed to Tanystropheus, so it has a long taxonomic history. But then the most recent species, in 2020, they found 2 morphotypes. So there's kind of a really small specimen that's skeletally mature at about 1.5 meters, and then Hydrodens, which is quite big, which is cool. And there's other specimens as well. The first Tanystropheus was found in the mid-19th century in Germany. It comes from the Middle Jurassic. And then other species or specimens have been found that have all been split kind of into these 3 species. And there's all sorts of different fossils. So as I mentioned, they are one of the longest known non-archosauriform archosauromorphs. And some of these species, hydrines, would have been at the same size, with larger specimens being up 5 to 6 meters long. And some of the smaller species were about 2 meters. The smallest species, which would have been Longibates would have been just about 1.5 meters pretty much. But these guys would have got between 32 to 78 kilograms, or between 72 to 164 pounds, so they would have been quite similar to a little bit lighter than large, like crocodiles of the same length, so very similar to larger lizards in size. So these guys have roughly triangular skulls with quite large teeth. So these guys would have had heterodont teeth, and very large teeth would have probably allowed them to hunt all sorts of slippery prey. These fruits would have been found. Two shapes would be similar to like early pterosaurs and some modern lizards, so potentially help for catching slippery prey, like fish that it would eat a lot of. And then hydrodens would have had a broader, flatter skull, so these guys would have been a little bit broader and flatter, which would be much more of a fish trap as well. Very large teeth, and was very superficially like a plesiosaur. And the most recognizable features, you can see that quite long neck. So they have a very long neck with about 13 vertebrae, and a lot of them are quite long vertebrae, and with long cervical ribs, so it would help support it, which is quite cool. And quite an interesting torso. They had a 12 dorsal vertebrae, which is more or less specialized, but they were quite short, so they just had a kind of typical body. And then the shoulder girdle was quite typical. Interclavicle was no plate like collarbone. It was like a long stalk to the rear. Nothing too interesting about them other than that. Mainly the big difference is the neck. They also have quite small hips, which is interesting. Unremarkable hips. And kind of a longer tail, which has got no evidence of big things like that. So as I mentioned, there were like other interpretations, especially with the classification. They were thought to be kind of related to plesiosaurs and nothosaurs, which is kind of, not surprising considering they've all got long necks, but turns out they're more closely related to dinosaurs than they are to plesiosaurs, which is interesting. So they are in the group Tanystropheus, which is early Archosauromorph. This is before you get your true Archosauromorphs like crocodiles and dinosaurs, and like Rhynchocephalia. They're actually sister to the Dinosaurs, which are another very interesting group of Archosauromorphs. And then some more recent ones have kind of suggested that again, were related to Proterosaurs and things like that. And then you have Crocopoda, which has the later ones, which is quite interesting. In terms of diet, their diets have been strongly debated, though most recent studies consider them to be fish-eating, so they would have been eating a lot of fish and cephalopods and marine things. Even some have suggested they might have been like marine iguanas and feeding on algae, but that's not considered true. The most likely function of their tricuspid teeth would have been to grip slippery prey, so through much like hooded seals or crab-eater seals, which have a similar diet. In terms of predation as well, these long necks would have made them quite vulnerable to predation. And we do have evidence of one that was actually decapitated by a large predator, which could have been a large ichthyosaur, most likely, maybe a crocodile of some kind, or crocodilian-like animal. And looking at the skull biocomatics, they would have had a lot of cranial kinesis that allows them to move their head quite a bit, and would have potentially have been interpreted as being a suction feeder, but that was rejected because they needed a raw, robust hyoid. That was an interpretation, but they don't need it. So likely they would have just quickly used their long neck to sneak up and grab things. Well, there's lots of evidence of their growth rate, which seems to be fairly slow. So these guys wouldn't have grown as fast as things like a lot of sauropod dinosaurs, things like that. Would have been quite similar to, would have been more similar to lizards in that regard, so they would have grown more like lizards. And they actually had some very interesting adaptations for breathing. So sauropods and giraffes as well, and adaptations to kind of reduce the dead space within their trachea so they could have more efficient breathing. So these guys would have had air sacs. These guys would have added specialized lungs to allow them to both dive and have these long necks. So these guys would have had a respiration system quite similar to modern archosaurs and turtles. So these lung capacity would have been too small for frequent activities on life in high altitudes. So this suggests they had an ecology of like an ambush predator. As well as the soft tissue, we do have some soft tissue of these guys from the rear part of the body, with like some scale impressions and things like that. And it seems like the tail would have been, that portion of it was rich in phosphates and things like that, which is quite cool. That's obviously how it was preserved. Looking at the brain and inner ear as well, they would have had quite a bulbous forebrain and had big olfactory bulbs, so it would have been quite good at sight and also quite good at smelling as well. So that probably would have helped them a lot in the water. And now we'll have a look at about the aquatic capabilities, and then we'll talk about the one on land. So there's been debate of how good swimmers and how good on land they were. So most recent evidence suggests that these guys would have been, they wouldn't have been able to kind of swim like lateral undulation, so they wouldn't have been able to swim kind of like a crocodile. Some evidence suggests that these guys would have swum, with their feet. Or they wouldn't have swum much at all. They weren't pursuit predators. They were most likely ambush predators. So a methodical and intermediate approach would have been good for these guys, as they don't have a lot of adaptations for exclusively marine life, but they probably would have been able to swim and use that long neck to kind of like reach out and grab into things, because they were able to sneak up into shells undetected, because they find the body, but they had this long neck to catch. It's very similar to how plesiosaurs are believed to have hunted. But yeah, so there is some debates. They don't have any specific adaptations for swimming, but they likely would have spent a lot of time at least around the coastal areas. And then we'll have a look at their land relatives, so we get to see them walking around on land. So let's have a look at this. Now, isn't that quite cool? So you can see their land capabilities. So these guys, as I mentioned, there have been different studies for everything between living on land and living in the water. So some would believe this is an active terrestrial predator and would have been fully capable on land. Most recent suggests that these guys would have had quite light necks, would have been very similar to a reptilian heron, kind of sitting near water and with their head above the water and grabbing stuff from the land. And there has been support for this lifestyle, but they very likely would have been able to be able to swim. They had powerful ligaments in their head and neck that allowed them to keep their body more stiff, so that would have kept them on the ground. But likely they would have had to swim, considering the habitat. They believed to potentially have swum kind of like frogs, kicking around, but they wouldn't have been able to swim very much, like a special. They would have not been able to swim or like a crocodile. Yeah, very, very interesting. Potentially a little bit like a crocodile, with tail movements being more effective at swimming, but these guys would have had little webbing potentially. So it's a little bit of a debate, which is quite interesting. Really, really cool. So that's Tanystropheus. So these are all these animals that I mentioned, Darwinopterus, Phosphatodraco, Cretoxyrhina, Aegirocassis, and Tanystropheus were all done by Gushy Gore and a bunch of other people who contributed to Season Skies pack. But we're going to be finishing off with Harsquark Tree. We've got a very interesting big mosasaur. We've got Thalassotitan. So this is Thalassotitan atrox. Very, very interesting animal. So this was described, this is an extinct genus of mosasaur that lived in the Maastrichtian of Morocco, that about 66 million years ago. So the only known species is T. atrox, and is found in the same place as Phosphatodraco, in the Obed Aldan Formation, and was described in 2022, so quite a recent one. It is believed to be a member of the Prognathidae family, so it's related to mosasaurs like Prognathodon, and the main reason you can tell them apart is because they've got quite massive jaws and robust teeth. So the genus name Thalassotitan means, Thalassa means sea, Titan giant, so basically it means the giant of the sea, and atrox means cruel or merciless, like Panthera atrox, like the cruel cat or something like that. So these guys were quite a large mosasaur, but potentially one of the largest. They got to about 1.3 meters in the skull, and body length of about 9 to 10 meters. So like most prognathodontids, these guys would have had quite large and round, like blunt and robust heads, and the teeth as well. So these guys would have been quite well adapted for biting into prey. They're quite similar to things like Prognathogon's saltator, being like big stocky teeth, though there would have been some variation obviously between individuals or young individuals, and so nothing too different there. And the postcranial is only not that well known, though it only represents a little bit more than the front half of the body. So these guys had a pelvic girdle quite similar to Mosasaurus conodon and other species of Prognathodon, even that resembled mosasaurines, forelimbs that resembled kind of Mosasaurus and Plotosaurus. So these guys would have been like a little bit of a mix of other things. So they would have not differed too much from mosasaurs, but some of them suggest these guys may have been a little bit more adapted, that had some derived and basal traits. But as I mentioned, they are a member of the group Prognathidae, and they included members such as Prognathodon and things like that. Its closest relatives, it's actually nestled within Prognathodon, which actually kind of suggested Prognathodon is paraphyletic, so there's likely going to be a split into other genera soon, so that's quite interesting, unless you want to lump Thalassotitan into Prognathodon. But yeah, in terms of its paleoecology, these guys would have lived in Morocco. As I mentioned, they would have been lived with the starkids like Alicone, starkids like Phosphatodraco, and animals such as Barbadactylus, Alicone, Tetradraco, as I've already mentioned before. But these guys would have lived with Ceta lamna, all sorts of really cool fish and sharks, Globidens, Zasfarus saurus, crocodilians, sea turtles, even unnamed titanosaurs and some lambeosaurians and stuff that would live on the land, small islands, and also lived with other giant mosasaurs such as Mosasaurus, Prognathodon, Gavalimus, and Kinninjara. And is also with like smaller ones like Pleurodens, Halosaurus, and Xenodens. So yeah, really, really cool animal. How can you not love a nice big mosasaur? So yeah, I think that finishes up for the day. So that was it by Hushquat Tree. So yeah, this is another very awesome episode. Really cool to talk about some interesting animals. Especially things that, we don't get covered a lot, and finally get some good pterosaurs. So yeah, I really, really, really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to get the little bell icon to get notified about anything. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.